Hi, my name's Ben King. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist in the Philadelphia area, and today we're going to talk about why we fight about small, stupid things that feel like they shouldn't be such big issues, but we keep kind of stumbling into and getting into conflict about. So first, the overview. Why is this important to talk about? The beginning of a conversation, why that's so important. What is a harsh startup? What's a soft startup? Real world examples and practical tips and ideas. All right, so first, why is this important to talk about? So communication is vital for a satisfying relationship. Pretty much every couple that I work with comes in because there's an issue with their communication, just the cycle that they get in with each other. That it's whether it's fighting, whether it's shutting down and just not communicating with each other, there's usually always something going on in the communication that's making things difficult for them to work through. So communication being very key for a satisfying relationship. Second, most people aren't given a model growing up that shows them how to communicate properly. It's usually one of two buckets that a person comes in, whether it's individual, whether it's a couple, and they either say that I grew up in a family where we never expressed things, whether it was positive, but especially negative. We just didn't talk about those things. Maybe we got frustrated, maybe we got upset, but we didn't bring it up to each other. That was just not something that we did. Or the other bucket of we were always fighting. We were never having productive conversations. It never went well. We were always fighting. It was always loud. We were always saying nasty things to each other. So it's usually one of those two buckets. I mean, it's pretty rare, at least for the clients that I have, where they come in and they say, I had this great, productive, healthy way of dealing with conflict that I learned from my family. And so the more difficult a situation is, the harder it is to have a dialogue around it. And so that's why it's so important to be able to work on these things, is that the more and more difficult the issue is, the more and more helpful having a roadmap of how to talk about it will be. And then lastly, there are so many ways to communicate that will take you off the rails. And the beginning is one of the most important parts. So there's actually very few ways that a conversation goes in a productive way. And there are so many that it can go in an unproductive way. So again, that's why it's important to be able to talk about, is that usually people aren't just going to fly by the seat of their pants and get it right without trying. I mean, this is something that takes effort and time to be able to, whether it's learn or just kind of stick with. Okay, so the beginning of a conversation, why that is so key. The beginning of the conversation sets the tone for how the rest of the conversation is going to go. I mean, if you imagine your partner or a family member or a friend coming to you and they come to the conversation in a very heated way, you kind of get the sense that that's where things are headed, that you're not thinking like, oh, maybe it's going to start off rocky, but it's going to get better later. No, I mean, it's like, yeah, if they come out really hot out of the gate, then it's just gonna go downhill. It's just gonna continue that way. And same thing the other way around. If they come to you and they're very vulnerable, they're opening themselves up to you, even if they're dealing with some frustration, that sets a very collaborative type of tone from the start. And then second, you're showing the other person why you're bringing it up. Is it to blame or is it to share? Same thing. If they bring it up in a very heated way and they're blaming, you can get the sense that, yeah, the other person is just trying to blame me. They're not actually trying to work through things right now. They're just wanting me to know how bad I was. And vice versa, if they come to you and they're vulnerable, that is showing you that they want to talk through it, that they want to get on the same page and move forward from there. And then lastly, an expert in the field, John Gottman, he can reliably predict what couples will divorce in the future based off of 3 minutes, the first 3 minutes in a conflict conversation that they're having. And that, I mean, that's significant to be able to predict that based off of the first 3 minutes. And it's not just making a point about how important this is for the conversation in and of itself. It's making the point on how important this is to the relationship overall. All right, and so a harsh startup, what is that? It's essentially coming in hot. It's aggressive or confrontational tone. So the tone is how you say things, not necessarily the things that you say, but how you say them. Shut down or volatile body language. So Again, if you come in and you're really shut down, or if you're pointing at the other person really aggressive, those would be examples of a harsh startup. Blaming statements. So again, blaming, saying it's the other person's fault, or being very critical, just really coming down hard on them. Exaggerated language is a big one that I often see. Words like always, never, or constantly. So if I come to you and I say, you're always doing this, I can't believe it, it's ridiculous, you're going to feel defensive because I'm using that type of language and I'm blaming you. Then lastly, this is also from John Gottman, the Four Horsemen. And so that is criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. So if any of those are there when it's the start of a conversation, it's usually not going to be a great, productive conversation. All right, and so next, a soft startup. And so what is that? That's calm and a softer tone. So again, it's the way that you say things. If I come to you and I say, hey, I just wanted to talk to you about something, I mean, that's to me, that's a very calm and soft tone to come with, even if I'm frustrated. Relaxed and open body language. So again, pointing, that's something that looks aggressive. Whereas if I'm more relaxed, it's going to make you just naturally less defensive. I statements and flexible language. So instead of saying you're doing this, you're doing that, I'm coming to you and just sharing my experience. So this is what it was like for me. I feel this way. I thought this in that moment. And again, those words like sometimes, you're not saying always, never, constantly. You're saying, hey, this sometimes happens and I just wanted to talk to you about it. Sharing to share instead of to blame. So again, instead of saying you're doing this, you're doing that, trying to share just so that you can share your experience, so that the other person can understand where you're coming from. I'm not trying to share this. I'm not trying to express this to build a case against you. I want to share this so that both of us can understand each other and move forward from there. Avoiding evaluation or judgment. And so when I'm expressing myself, I'm going to avoid saying that you're doing this because you're always this way, or this is a part of you that is just, it's bad, or it's deficient, or you need to do all of these things differently. Even if there's a grain of truth in those things, avoiding judgment is a very good idea to try to have a productive conversation. And then lastly is just being very intentional about it. Usually when we're frustrated or upset, we're not intentional going into those situations. We're fired up, we're really frustrated, so we just go in there, it just spills out. We just say whatever we want to say. But instead, to be intentional, to think to yourself, what do I want to say that will be taken well, that will be productive? All right, and so these are some real world examples. So this could be an example of a harsh startup. So this is Jim saying, I come home from work every day and you don't say anything to me. You don't even stop what you're doing to greet me. It's ridiculous. And then his partner, yeah, probably because when you come home, you're in such a bad mood. Why would I want to be close to that? So clearly this way of starting a conversation didn't work for either person. Jim tried to bring up a concern, but his message was filled with criticism and intensity. And then this made Amy feel attacked and led her to shoot right back. So again, it's not that this worked for one person, so it's okay to do a harsh startup. This works for neither one of them, and that's why it's even more important to do things differently. And so this could be an example of a soft startup. So this is Jim. Hey, Amy, it feels like there's distance between us when I get home, and it's been difficult for me to deal with. I was hoping we could talk about that and if there's anything that we could do. And then Amy, yeah, I've noticed that too. And we can definitely talk about it. What's been difficult for you to deal with? So what a soft startup does is that it sets the two up for having a much more productive conversation and coming closer together. You will need to continue working on your effective communication skills to keep the conversation on track. The soft startup is what gets us off on the right foot, but we need to keep things there throughout. So for example, I mean, if you start with a soft startup and the other person responds well or just better than usual, but then you just kind of go into your tirade, I mean, that's not going to do anything because the conversation went off the rails. And so again, you can start with a soft startup, but you need to keep going afterwards. All right, and so practical tips with all of this. Ask if they can talk at that moment. this is a really good way to show them that, again, you want to be collaborative. You're not going in there head first and just kind of going on this lecture, even if they're not ready to talk about it. You're asking them almost for permission to be able to talk about it. And then next, talk with a calm tone and try to get in that relaxed posture. So if you remember anything, just try to remember calm tone. This plays out so often in my sessions where a more intense tone, a more aggressive tone will be responded with by the other person with shutting down or escalation or something along those lines. But if it's a calm tone, even if the couple still has some trouble with it, I mean, it helps so much. Avoid the 4 horsemen. So again, criticism, contempt, stonewalling, defensiveness. And then in general, try to open yourself up to the other person instead of building a case for why you're right. Share your perspective, share your experience in a calm way so that they can hear you. Again, what you're trying to do is share your experience. If you're trying to build a case, even if you have really good points, the other person is often not going to actually hear you. So a lot of the times, the best way to get your point across is to share your perspective in a more subjective way. All right, so if you feel frustrated or upset, take some time away from each other. This is either if something happened and you're frustrated and you haven't necessarily talked about it yet, yeah, definitely take some time away, whether it's at least 20 minutes, whether it's a few hours. And this is also true when you're trying to have a conversation. Like if things start to get heated, take a time out. Say to each other like, hey, things aren't going so well right now. Let's regroup in half an hour. And the 20 minutes thing is important. When you're starting to have an argument, both of you are likely going to be emotionally flooded. And so what that means is that physiologically, you're almost unable to be able to have a productive conversation. And so oftentimes, the only thing that you can do is take time apart so that you can regulate your emotions and so that you can kind of cool off and then go back to that conversation. Another point I would say is in that time, don't just ruminate about how wrong the other person is and how right you are. Like when you're taking time apart, again, be intentional about it. Think to yourself, what do I want to say when we come back? Not necessarily what does my gut want to say, like how do I want to lecture the other person, but what do I want to say? What am I intending to say to the other person when we come back together? And then remember that you want to work through this together and not against each other. Again, it might sound kind of cheesy, but those types of reminders, saying to yourself when you're frustrated, okay, I'm frustrated, and that is understandable, that makes sense. But I want to try to work with the other person here. I'm not trying to work against them. I'm not trying to hurt them or jam my perspective or jam my opinions down their throat. Like this is something that I want to work together on. And so, yeah, let me try to come at it in a different way when we come back together and talk about it. All right, so that's pretty much it. I mean, if you need more help talking through these things or figuring out different ways of how to be able to communicate, obviously see a couples therapist. That will help you communicate in a different way, whether it's just giving specific tools, but couples therapists can also help within the cycle. So for example, some couples come in and they know the tools that they need to use, but they have a tough time actually using those in the moment. So a couples therapist can be very good at just providing a space in their own input in their own direction to be able to break those conversations up so that they don't just go the usual way, so that maybe they start to get a little bit off course, but then the couples therapist is there to be able to pull everyone back on the rails. But like I said, that's pretty much it. So as usual, I hope that this was informative. If you know anyone that you feel like would benefit from it, feel free to share it with them, and I will see everyone in the next video.